us continue with our discussions on the project feasibility studies in the context of integrated design project. We focus on the economic feasibility as well as the financial feasibilities. The economic feasibility involves studying the market, potential customers, competitors, as well as the unique characteristics of your product. Studying the market may involve studying the Malaysian economy as well as the real estate market when it comes to the development in the construction industry. There are various data and informations available in the internet. The greatest challenge it will be translating those informations into something meaningful to your project so that you can make those informations useful as you work out the strategies and plan in order to stimulate the sales of your project. You can study the market both at the macroeconomic level and the microeconomic levels. The macroeconomic is broader, whereas the microeconomics it would be narrower. Studying the macroeconomic allows you to know the overall environment as well as the trend, whether it is friendly to your development project, and see how you can scale your project towards the overall trend in order to increase your chances of success undertaking the project. Whereas you also need to study the microeconomics to be more specific so that you can take full advantage of the supply and demand conditions while working out for your strategy and plan to encourage the sales of your projects. At the macroeconomic level, you can study the whole economy of Malaysia, probably looking into the GDP, Gross Domestic Product. What is GDP? It is basically a monetary measure of the market value of all finished goods and services produced and sold in Malaysia. It is often used by the government as an indicator to its economic wealth. How can we make sense of the GDP? We can make relative comparison with previous years, as well as get the expert projections of the following years. Normally, this GDP data is half a year lagging. That means when the GDP is freshly announced, it is actually based on the data half a year back. You can compare the GDP with the previous years. If the current GDP is better than the previous GDP, that means the economic conditions of Malaysia is better as compared to the previous years. Then you're going to expect this may bring to positive effect to the construction industry, where the citizens of Malaysia is more likely to have the ability to purchase properties or to invest properties. You may also observe the projected GDPs for the following years to know the trend, as you know that your construction project will take few years to be completed. By studying the GDP, you can have an idea of the economic cycles of Malaysia. There are good times, there are bad times. Now the construction industry is very much affected by the economic cycles. As for the microeconomic levels, you can look into individual markets. Let's say you study into the town or cities where your development project is situated, and to observe the development at that particular regions. Some are developing rapidly, while some others may be developing slowly. This also giving you an idea whether you should be optimistic or pessimistic while doing your sales forecast for your development project. You can also study the national incomes and also the individual incomes in certain specific markets or your potential customers. At the national levels, probably you could consider to investigate which age group of Malaysian citizens is more likely to purchase properties, and why is it so? Is it somewhere in their 40s, late 30s, or early 40s? Knowing your target group, then you can also observe their incomes. What will be their income range? Then you have an idea how you're going to set your selling price of the properties for your development project, meeting their capacity of undertaking the properties. You may also study the individual incomes of certain specific markets. Some cities may have more young peoples than the others, whereas some towns may not have as much middle-aged peoples. Then probably had a study in their income range. Similarly, you get an idea their purchasing powers if they wish to acquire properties. You can also analyze the total employment in the economy of Malaysia. This is another indicator to the economic health of our country, which allow you to have some group projections in terms of the sales of your properties after development. You can also analyze the demand and supply of the labors for similar purposes. Also, you can deal with the household and firms' decisions, study their behaviors, as they can be your potential customers, allowing you to strategize your development project as well as your marketing strategies. At the macroeconomic levels, you might want to look into the inflations, as it can indirectly influence the OPR, overnight policy rate, which can govern the interests when a person is undertaking housing loans, personal loans, and others. And also you can study the supply and demand of properties of similar natures of your development. Getting these informations, you should have an idea that they are referring to the macroeconomics or microeconomics. Macroeconomic levels represent the overall trend. It gives you some ideas regarding the future prospects, which is very likely to be in the trend that can affect your project to some extent. As for the microeconomics levels, you want to verify whether the individual markets is it following exactly with the overall trend. Sometimes it can be slightly ahead or slightly behind, depending the towns and the cities that your development project is situated. This can give you a better reflections in terms of the potential sales of your properties after developments. We mentioned that the greatest challenge it will be translating those informations into something meaningful to your project, which in the context of the project feasibility studies for the integrated design project, students are giving exposures and given the opportunity to practice and to experience through the process of understanding those economic informations, apply the critical thinking skills, synthesize the knowledge, and then make some reasonable judgment in terms of the potential market, so that you can work out sound strategies to encourage the sales of your projects. One of the ways to do this is always to have a purpose for studying certain informations. For example, those listed here. Let's say now you are doing an analysis on the average household income, the local versus the national. If you're able to get those data, then you will have an idea whether the local markets is running ahead or behind the overall national household income. If the average household income of the local is greater than the nationals, most likely these are big cities, the economies are booming. You're going to expect better sales potentials as a result of this. This of course needs to be compared with the average selling price, which you can compare between the local market and the national levels. This will help you to assess the potential buying power of your targeted customers. Let's say now you are in big cities. The average household income in the city, representing the local market, is slightly higher than the average household income of the national level, and then you compare the average selling price. If the average selling price is significantly larger than the national levels, this may reflect a reduced potential buying powers of peoples in these cities. You may not necessarily only look into those data in 1 year. You can also compare those data in the previous years to observe the trend, to have some ideas in terms of the potential buying powers. Let us look at another scenario. Assuming the average selling price is more or less similar, but the average household income at the local market is significantly larger than the national levels. This reflects the better buying power of your potential customers. What you can see here, the average household income and the average selling price can give you valuable information in terms of the potential buying power of your targeted customers. Higher buying power is normally associated with relatively higher household income as compared to lower selling price. You can see this at the national levels and also at the local levels. As you can see, some cities are developing faster than the others. You may also compare the information with the historical data in previous years for you to have an idea whether the buying power is growing or shrinking. Next, you may also look into the supply and demand of labors, especially in the case of Malaysia. The construction industry rely heavily on labors. When the demand is relatively larger than the supply of the labors, the cost of labor will increase. This shall subsequently increase the production cost for your development project. In contrary, when the supply surpasses the demand, you can get cheap labor. That means this can reduce your production costs. There are many factors that can influence the supply and demand, which in Malaysia, the government policies on the foreign workers plays a significant role, as well as whether the local peoples are willing to undertake those jobs. Next, you may also look into the supply and demand for the goods, raw materials, and machineries. Same principles. When the demand is higher than the supply, the cost of production shall increase. Otherwise, the cost of production shall reduce. While looking into the cost of the goods, materials, and machineries, you should also consider the inflations. Especially in recent years, the inflation is relatively high. This can lead to uncertainty in terms of the costing for the goods, materials, and machineries used in the construction project, especially when you bid for the tender, as well as when you are setting the selling price. You might need to factor in the implications of the inflations. to ensure the profitability of the project. You may want to look into the overnight policy rate, as this is going to bring impacts on the interest, on the debt, and the cash flow of the company, as well as the customers. Higher OPR leads to higher interest rate charged by the bank if we are taking the loans. This applies to both companies and the customers if they are taking the loans. Interest on you as a company may affect your cash flow and deteriorate your profit, whereas high interest to the customers can influence their buying powers for properties. You can also look into the gross domestic product, GDP. This gives us an idea on the national economic state, whether the economy is growing or shrinking. With the growing economies, that means more people are earning money and they are more willing to invest properties or purchase their own properties, and they are willing to take risks. Now, if the GDP is shrinking, that means you're going to expect tough time ahead. Now, the sales of your properties may not be as promising. Before undertaking the development project, you will need to ensure yourself to have sufficient holding powers, which you might need to hold the property for a longer period until they are sold. The worst case scenario is you will have to keep the properties for not being able to successfully sold to the customers. Next, you might want to look into the foreign exchange rate between the Malaysian ringgit and the US dollar. This is going to influence the import costs. For example, steels, which is used extensively. Importing steels will require you to do the business transactions normally in US dollar. Normally, you will have to convert your Malaysian ringgit into US dollar for the business deal. When Malaysian ringgit is weaker, that means you need more Malaysian ringgit to be converted into an equivalent amount of US dollar in exchange to the import products. This can lead to the increase of the production costs. Some other informations include the populations, the growth, the age distributions, the capital per household. This provides some indications in terms of the local demand as well as the potential customers. Not only that, you might need to also study their consumption behaviors as well as the household debt to have an idea in terms of their buying powers. Looking into the household income is one thing. If the general household debt is relatively high, this may also lead to influence in their abilities to buy properties, especially when the debt ratio is relatively high. Normally, banks do not like to loan monies to the customers. There may be risks of not being able to repay the loan. You can also look into the government policies, such as annual government budget, their policies and regulations in terms of the stamp duty, tax exemptions, and others. Also, the geopolitical tracks that can also influence the economy of Malaysia, the willingness to buy properties, and also the cost of the materials, particularly those are supposed to be imported. You may also look into the supply and demand of the product. In this case, your product, it will be your development project, such as the residential units, commercial units, and others. You might need to study the potential market to have an idea whether the market can absorb new properties and how quickly the market will consume those properties. In some areas, the supply is greater than demand. When you walk around the nearby areas, you see a lot of vacant units looking for sales and rent. In this case, probably the supply has already been greater than the demand. Then you will have to look into your development and evaluate yourself whether the market is likely to absorb the new supply of your development. In some areas, the development goes rapidly. New properties are always taken and fully occupied. That means now the demand is higher than the supply. Then you can be more optimistic in terms of your sales forecast. Next, you might need to do some analysis in terms of the selling price in promotions or roadshow. This is for you to have an idea in terms of the market price of similar properties. You can actually join the roadshows or search for the relevant informations in social medias. There are many channels for you to know the market price. And then you can do some simple analysis by calculating the cost per unit land area as well as the cost per unit building areas. This shall give you some ideas for a reasonable estimations in terms of the cost of the properties.